Dear friends, please would you sit. Well, good evening and welcome to St. George's Chapel and to the 2025 Elson Ethics Lecture. It is my very great pleasure as Dean of Windsor to introduce our speaker this evening. Not, as I am sure you will agree, our speaker needs any sort of introduction to this audience. But let me begin by saying how delighted I am to see so many of you here tonight. The Elson Ethics Lecture is a significant part of the House programme, and your testimony here this evening is testimony to that fact. Many of you will know that it is the generosity of Ambassador Edward Elson and his family that enables us to host this lecture each year. We are enormously grateful to them and so pleased to have Lewis Elson with us in chapel this evening. Such a wonderful supporter of the work of the House and the College in many ways. Now, Canon Finlay, Hueston, has been Warden of St. George's House since 2008. In that time, he and his team have established the house as a place where wisdom is truly nurtured through dialogue. You need only look at the house programme to see that the founding vision of the late Prince Philip and Dean Robin Woods continues to be honoured at a very high level indeed. Hueston has been an inspiration on so many fronts, intellectual, pastoral and theological. And if I may say, in my 2 years now as Dean, I've enjoyed and benefited from serving this wonderful place with him. We will miss Hueston when he leaves us, but we wish him well in his new and distinguished role as Dean of Chapel, King's College, Cambridge, and we wish him and Anna every happiness in this new phase of their lives. Before he departs, however, we are delighted that he is to give this year's Elson Ethics Lecture. I know that the Elson family are thrilled to have his name on the roster of distinguished speakers, and there could be no more fitting way to draw his own tenure at St. George's House to a close. Hueston's lecture will last approximately 35 minutes, after which our programme director will conduct a short interview. We'll then adjourn to the Dean's Cloister for a drinks reception. With such a title as Is It True That There Is Truth, with all its biblical, theological and philosophical resonance, it is very tempting to anticipate something of the thinking that Hueston will take us through this evening. But the risk of cheapening what is to follow by my own pennyworth is too great. So I will resist and wait for the pearls to come. Except that is to say, to contend for the truth that the question our lecturer poses to us this evening is of immense significance to our times, as indeed it has been to any time. And so, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, it is my great pleasure to ask Dr. Hueston Finlay to deliver the 2025 Elson Ethics Lecture. Hueston.
Mr. Dean, ladies and gentlemen, it is my great honour to deliver the Elson Ethics Lecture for 2025, and I thank the Dean for his very kind words and introduction. Although Ambassador Elson is not here this evening, it has been my privilege to have enjoyed his friendship over the past 20 years and that of his family. As the Dean said, it is especially good to have Lewis here to represent the family this evening. The Ambassador has been extremely supportive of the House over a sustained period of time and has been very kind in his support to me personally with his wise counsel and advice. To him and to his family, I extend my deepest gratitude. So let's see if the Dean's thoughts were right and I go the road he thought I might travel. Let me begin by asking you a question. What right now is the greatest challenge to our humanity? I suspect a great many of you might opt for climate change. Despite the very few deniers, this is an acknowledged problem, and it's generally agreed that it is now too late to avoid all the impacts of climate change, but it's not too late to avoid the very worst outcomes. If this were not the case, we might as well follow the Greek philosopher Epicurus and eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we're going to die. But no, there are still measures that can be taken, and it is ethically incumbent upon us that all mitigation and resilience be investigated thoroughly and realized where possible. The ethical dimension comes across loud and clear in Antonio Gutierrez's speech at the opening session of COP30 in Brazil. And the ambition for rescuing 1.5% is laid out in graphic detail in the climate analytics report published at the beginning of this month. Although theologically phrased, these were precisely the points made in the papal encyclical Laudato Si. The Church of England, anxious not to waste paper, failed to respond in kind, but it did pragmatically produce a two-pager on how best to approach carbon neutrality in local church buildings. But there is one final point here I should like to make. In respect of climate change, we have been here before. We have not seen this level of climate change, but as human beings, we have been through what is known as the Little Ice Age. There's a famous painting by Adam van Breen, the 17th century Dutch painter, depicting skaters on the River Amstel in 1611, when Europe was experiencing unusually cold and harsh weather. What was to blame? Several factors, no doubt, but certainly large volcanic eruptions, low solar activity, and an increase in carbon dioxide produced by the regrowth of forests responding to the decline in population. The people of the time, however, were not much interested in the what question and sought more to answer who. Fingers of accusation were pointed at lazy farmers, foreigners, witches, and even if they were in existence, they were surely not culpable. Climate change, then, is a reasonable answer to my question. But I say to you, there is an even greater threat to humanity, and it is the decay of truth. Truth, for reasons that will become apparent, sits at the heart of what it is to be human. It's in the intellectual bloodstream that feeds our personal and societal existence. Right now, however, truth, the value that is truth, and the respect for truth is decaying, and its rotting corpse threatens what it means to be human. Unlike with climate change, there is no general agreement that we are facing an existential threat. The English language has even evolved to cope with this loss of confidence in truth, with the coinage of new words and phrases: post-truth, fake news, doublespeak, alternative facts, echo chambers, deep fakes, spin, disinformation, to name but a few. The view of this lexical development is not uniform, precisely because it's not agreed that we are in the midst of such a deep threat, even an ethical threat. It was not an ethically neutral stance, for instance, when Sean Spicer, the White House press secretary in 2017, claimed that the Trump inauguration had drawn, and I quote, "the largest audience to witness an inauguration, period, both in person and around the globe." When contrary photographic evidence was provided, Kellyanne Conway just shrugged and explained that Spicer was providing alternative facts. I will want to suggest that it makes no sense whatsoever to speak of alternative facts. But for the moment, like a good bottle of red, I will leave the wine to breathe. Again, unlike with climate change, we are not in a position yet to seek solutions. And that's partly due to liberal views born of research in the humanities that now find themselves revitalized in the rhetoric of right-wing politicians and commentators. And to this too we shall return. And yet one last analogical comparison. As with climate change, we have been here before. And it didn't go well. Been here before? Yes, indeed. And it all began with the technological revolution that was the printing press. Before the invention of the printing press in the 15th century, documents were propagated by copying. Someone had to take a scroll, for example, and copy it by hand. It was time-intensive, to say the least, it was expensive, and it was prone to transcription error. Due to the creativity of Gensfleisch, better known to us as Gutenberg, there was now an industrial process, a means of producing books, and even more importantly, pamphlets in huge volumes. The earliest works, through the printing presses of Gutenberg and his like-minded technophiles, were religious. In fact, they were letters of indulgence, offering afterlife remission in return for support of the papal wars against the invading Turks. Those indulgences would soon change focus. The new project would become the building of St. Peter's in Rome. And it's at this point an unknown Augustinian monk by the name of Martin Luther entered the fray. He shrewdly employed this new invention to propound his claim that the church ought to be reformed. It all began in 1517 with his post-it note nailed to the door of the Cathedral Church of Wittenberg, calling for a reform of ecclesial practice. Soon afterwards, in collaboration with the press owners in Wittenberg, he started producing two very important sets of documents. The first was his translation of the Bible into the vernacular, and the second, increasingly hostile pamphlets. All of a sudden, the text of the Bible was taken out of the exclusive hand of the church and placed into the open hand of the literate reader. This led to a significant change in the repository of truth. While previously everybody looked to the church to tell them what the Bible said, now the vernacular Bible made it possible for anyone who could read to have their own interpretation. Now, do bear in mind that only around 10% of the population were literate, so it was not, as it might be today, that the Bible text was suddenly available to everyone, but it was available to many more. And some of them, many of them, with political desire for control and expansion. The Reformation, as Luther saw it, was a matter of theological truth, but it took no time at all before spiritual motivations were being cynically invoked to spiritual motivations were being ignored to legitimate cynical economic and political changes. Very clearly seen in the Peasants' War that started 7 years after Luther nailed his theses. The origin of that war began not with a text, but with a vision. In 1476, in a little hamlet of Niklashausen, a shepherd by the name of Hans Behem had heard the Virgin Mary explain that there would be no further oppression of the poor. And although relatively local at this stage, uprisings began to occur with alarming frequency. Once Bibles rolled off the press, the downtrodden read the text as divine approval for their cause. Luther was appalled and urged negotiation in place of revolt, but the horse had bolted. The peasants came off far worse in this war, losing some 100,000 souls. The 30 Years' War, a century later, founded on this same new understanding of authority, would surpass the bloodiness and loss of life when 25% of all Germans died. This lengthy conflict only came to an end when all parties, being exhausted and their populations decimated, signed the Peace of Westphalia in 1648, an agreement that would last roughly until the onset of the French Revolution in 1789. Turning our attention away from Central Europe and towards England, we find perhaps the greatest reforming voice in the person of William Tyndale, a translator and theologian. He fiercely pitched Scripture against church, urging his readers to trust the Bible over priests, ceremonies, and inherited practices. The result of this insistence was schism and violence. The violence was seen both metaphysically and metaphorically. We see the metaphysical form in Tyndale's own vitriolic correspondence with his erstwhile friend George Joy on questions of translation. And we see a rather all too physical, violent form evident in the increasingly febrile court of the Tudors. Henry VIII, a serious student of the Scriptures, was nonetheless uncomfortably accustomed to violence. We need think no further than the treatment of his wives. Or Mary, his daughter, who earned the nickname Bloody Mary for good reason, as she approved executions by fire up and down the country. Schism also grew in the ground of the Reformation soil. Amidst a culture of suspicion, champions of intolerance grew in number. There was a lot of us and them. A lot of, you are either for us or you are for them. So much for this well-known and documented history. How was it that intolerance and all this dreadful loss of life was made possible? In a recent book under the title The Decay of Truth, it was argued that for such things to take place, 4 conditions are required. First, an increasing disagreement about facts and scientific interpretation of data. Second, a blurring between opinion and fact. Third, an increase in the volume of opinion and experience over and against fact. And finally, a decline in the trust placed in former authorities. And here there was increasing disagreement between Catholics and Protestants, and between Protestants and other Protestants, about how to interpret the text. There was a blurring of lines between raw opinion about the text and how the text might be faithfully read. There was no little eisegesis going on. That is, readers reading into the text what they would like to see there. And finally, at least on the Protestant side, there was a decline in the trust that had once been placed in the church. You might even want to think of the sola scriptura principle as a fatal blow to any structure constructed upon ecclesial authority. My point here is obvious. The Reformation brought in its wake questions about truth, the nature of truth, and the appropriate authorities that safeguard truth. Those questions were accompanied by distrust, intolerance, and death. We have been here before, and it did not go well. But now let us turn our attention away from the particular context of the Reformation to our own circumstances. In my opening remarks on the decay of truth, I mentioned that incredibly vacuous phrase, alternative facts. To my mind, this phrase makes no sense, because a fact is either a fact or it's not. Let me support my point of view with just a few practical everyday examples. First, it seems to me that it is a fact that UK drivers drive on the left-hand side of the road. This is not open to an alternative view. It's not open to a perspective. To drive on the right-hand side would not only be to both cause a traffic offence, but it would be a danger to other users of the road. Here, surely, we're dealing with a fact. We also deal with the fact when we go shopping. We hand over £5 for an item that costs £2, and we reasonably expect to receive £3 in change. In this instance, we're dependent on some basic mathematical facts. And lastly, we deal with a fact when we pick up a mobile phone. The phone may be able to do much more than simply make a telephone call, but it is indisputably yet a mobile phone. When, like the walrus in Lewis Carroll's Through the Looking Glass, we speak of shoes and ships and sealing wax and cabbages and kings, we are engaged in the universe of truth, of fact. It's a fact that on the 11th day of November in the year 2025, Charles III is the King of England. It's a fact. Moreover, it's only a small intellectual step to define a fact as that which is true. Facts, by definition, are true. They are not open to alternative perspectives. And you would think that pretty clear, but in our 21st century culture, doubts are cast on this definition. So how did these doubts arise? What is it in our culture that allows us to think it makes some kind of sense to talk of alternative facts? What's the intellectual history behind this incredible position? The story begins, to my mind, with Protagoras. Now, he's thriving around 450 BC, and he's famous for his saying, "Man is the measure of all things." As with much early Greek philosophy, we learn about his views by reading Plato and Plato's records of Socrates' conversations. In the Theaetetus, for example, Protagoras is absent, but one of his disciples, Theodorus, is being challenged by Socrates. Perhaps we ought to say, says Socrates, that your belief is true for you, but false for many thousands of people. Theodorus, now slightly caught up in a windy argument, decides to agree and proposes that truth and falsity are dependent upon individual impressions. Socrates will have none of this. But it is Theodorus's view that an individual's impressions are at the heart of truth that is of particular interest to us. Note, however, that although Protagoras believes the human is the measure, he does not conclude that every human being is entitled to their own view of things. Instead, he says that it follows from his argument that human beings simply cannot offer a view about anything. He lands us in the sea of unknowability, of skepticism. Now, the Protagorean position was not fondly read, as you might imagine, by medieval philosophers much interested in metaphysics, or the 17th rationalists like Descartes and Spinoza. In the 19th century, however, it found a new lease of life in the person and writing of Friedrich Nietzsche. This wearer of the largest moustache of all time, this arch debunker, took on Protagoras' measure doctrine and allowed it to infiltrate his system. Reading Nietzsche should always come with an intellectual health warning. Much of his writing is composed of short, disconnected paragraphs. There's nothing that's systematic about Nietzsche, and that has led to a huge range of interpretations of his philosophy, if indeed he does have a philosophy. The whole business is messy. He's a philosophical nightmare. And yet, his influence on our contemporary culture and its discussions on truth is profound. In his late book, The Will to Power, he very clearly writes, "There are no facts, only interpretations." There are no facts, only interpretations. Now, of course, there's a very blatant problem with this claim, that if there are no facts, then the claim that there are no facts cannot itself be a fact. Nietzsche's always getting himself caught in philosophical circles. But let us put that problem to one side and acknowledge that the statement itself, that there are no facts and only interpretations, can lead to the rampant relativism that conjures up phrases like alternative facts. Yet this is a great example of the difficulty faced when reading Nietzsche, precisely because his writing is messy and uncontrolled and unsystematic. Readers see in his work what they would like to see and not what is necessarily going on. I would argue that Nietzsche is not really a relativist. He's a perspectivalist. In another late book on the genealogy of morals, he has another oft-quoted phrase: "There is only perspective seeing. There is only perspective knowing." His point is not that a person can have any view they want, but that every person does have a view. They have a position, if you will, from which to see things. The saying misattributed to Winston Churchill that history is written by the victors is an expression of precisely this line of thought. It's also reasonable to assume, for example, that somebody looking at the Eiffel Tower from the east will have a different view to somebody looking from the south. Indeed, The 19th century short story writer Guy de Maupassant so deplored the Eiffel Tower that he ate lunch every day at a restaurant in the tower because it was the one place in Paris from which he couldn't see the tower itself. Another perspective. Nietzsche, then, was not an all-out relativist. He was a perspectivalist. And to this extent, he has been somewhat misunderstood. Perspectivalism, however, is a little helpful when thinking about values, not so much when dealing about facts. When dealing about values, it seems self-evident that while I might value cricket more than you value soccer, misguidedly, I feel certain, you might have it the other way around. You might value soccer more than cricket. That conceded, the problems raise their ugly heads when we get involved in daily life. Here we need to know the constant rules of the road, basic mathematics, and the agreed workings of language. A scientist, by way of another example, will not make progress unless her understanding is constructed on constant laws and constant magnitudes. Such matters are not open to perspective. Of course, I readily acknowledge that no matter how much I protest, Nietzsche's philosophy is alive and well in our contemporary world. Not only is there a decisive move in the direction of relativism, there is yet another move that questions the very validity of talk about truth. Take, for example, the 20th century philosopher Richard Rorty, who suggested, and I take this to heart, only old-fashioned metaphysical prigs talk of truth anymore. If we take Protagoras and Nietzsche together as influencers of our current modes of thinking, you get an understanding of why we are where we are. Each in their own way have promoted the four conditions for the decay of truth that we encountered in our discussion of the Reformation. They have led to the birth of crazy notions like alternative facts, which in turn allow for the disagreement about facts. The rise in relativism, in particular, has blurred the line between opinions and facts. Everyone on social media is entitled to their point of view, and all views are seen as equal. With the advent of the internet, there's been an explosion in the volume of opinion and incessant attention to personal experience at the cost of proper regard for facts. And as we all know too well, there is a steady decline in trust in the formerly respected authorities, the sources that we once held important for factual information, even to the point where Michael Gove, a politician, once remarked in a television interview that the people of this country have had enough of experts. I'm not convinced. Anyone with a serious illness might like to have expert medical opinion before they consulted the butcher, the baker, and the candlestick maker. Thus far, I have restricted myself to truth as closely conditioned by facts. But I want to go one step further. Charles Dickens' novel Hard Times opens with the schoolmaster Thomas Gradgrind pontificating thus: "Now what I want is facts. Teach these boys and girls nothing but facts. Facts alone are wanted in life. Plant nothing else, root out everything else. You can only form the minds of reasoning animals upon facts. Nothing else will ever be of any service to them. It's the principle on which I brought up my own children, and it's the principle on which I will bring up these children. Stick to the facts. Of course, this is part of Dickens' reaction to utilitarianism, but he has his novel go on to explore the possibility that truth goes deeper than sheer fact. There is much to be gained by listening to another of his characters in this novel, Sissy, the daughter of a circus performer, as she explores through story the care of the neighbor and moral imagination. But here too, we find this broader cultural notion of truth under attack. Allow me to introduce yet another pernicious attack on truth, one that has more to do with the humanities and research than it does with philosophy. It's called authorial intention. Those of you who know me well will know that I am a student of the writings of Friedrich Schleiermacher, hardly, I will admit, a household name. Naturally, I don't follow him blind, and I recognize that there's an awful lot in Schleiermacher upon which we could improve, but he was the first person to write a systematic account of what is going on when you and I read a text, when we interpret. That's a discipline referred to now in the fancy word hermeneutics. For Schleiermacher, hermeneutics has this objective: to understand an author better than the author understood themselves. Schleiermacher suggests that a writer has thoughts that they wish to communicate, or a speaker has thoughts that they wish to communicate, and that it's the task of the reader or the hearer to excavate those thoughts from the text or the speech. That's the epitome of authorial intention, the desire to understand what a speaker or a writer is seeking to communicate. That desire to understand is obviously most important when we're faced with canonical texts, cultural, literary, political, legislative, or even religious. When we sit in front of those texts, we want to know what they are intended to communicate. We want to know what the author is saying to us. This is not, mind you, the way of contemporary literary criticism, the practices of which often find their way into the thought forms of the opponents of truth. Unlike scholars from most of the humanities, the literary critic has typically, although not universally, but typically driven a wedge between the text and its author. By this, I mean that for a theologian reading Augustine, it's important to understand the circumstances in which Augustine was writing and who Augustine was and what he was trying to teach. A theologian is attempting, at least attempting, to understand what Augustine was wanting to say. The literary critic is not so obliged. Why so? Well, the answer to that question is complex, but at least one answer lies with the French critic by the name of Roland Barthes. He once suggested that a text is not to be associated with its author. In a short and brutal article, highly influential, under the title "The Death of the Author," he explained his thinking. Published in 1967, so not recently, he attacks the idea that there is a connection between a text and its author. He stands, we might say, in a duel with Schleiermacher. And he wins. Or at least he wins in that space reserved for the literary critic. He has no interest in what the author might have meant. He disregards the author and gives primacy to the reader. He asks, what do you, the reader, think this text means? And once he asks that question, he has now leapt into the dangerous waters of relativism. The leap cuts the connection between author and reader. It leads, as the essay suggests it might, to the death of the author. It's a brutal act of literary homicide. Moreover, to claim that intentions don't matter, or that text can mean whatever a reader pleases, places reading practice disturbingly close to authoritarianism and totalitarianism of the kind we find in some modern political institutions. It's what I meant earlier when I spoke of liberal views born of research in the humanities that now find themselves revitalized in the rhetoric of right-wing commentators. The liberal scholar has provided the right-wing commentator with tools of mass destruction, and the liberal is left with no riposte. Moreover, suggesting that readers can and should hear whatever they wish when reading particularly difficult texts, especially those written allegorically, is a problem. Let me give you one concrete text. It comes from the pen of Jonathan Swift, a erstwhile Dean of St. Patrick's Cathedral in Dublin. In his modest proposal of 1729, Swift memorably writes, "I am assured by a very knowing American of my acquaintance in London that a healthy child, well nursed, is at a year old a most delicious nurturing and wholesome food, whether stewed, roasted, baked, or boiled, and I've no doubt it will be equally served in a fricassee or a ragout." Now, faced with this text, the reader has a choice. Either they believe that Swift was making a serious suggestion, or they believe that he was being satirical and ironical, writing allegorically with the intention of pointing us to the plight of Dublin's poor in the early 18th century. In this particular case, it is precisely because we pay attention to Swift's intention that we decide that this is satire. Naturally, retrieving authorial intention from a text is an uncertain process and is never final, and yet it is vitally important. Why? Because communication is central to what it is to being human. Metaphorically killing an author, whether they are communicating through artifact or the written or spoken word, is to denigrate our very humanity. The word which the author is communicating is suffocated, and with that the author or the speaker's humanity is significantly diminished, and their truth is lost. To those who say the hope of retrieving an authorial intention is a pipe dream, I reply with a firm no. It's not a pipe dream, it's a vision of a better reality. And that reality itself is founded on our notion of truth. If we look to the etymology of the word truth, we find that it derives from the Middle English word troth. Now, that's a word you will know well because you will have heard it read at a Book of Common Prayer service of marriage. The groom says to his bride, "And thereto I plight thee my troth." He promises to his bride truth, faith, fidelity, and trust. For this reason, there is an ethical responsibility placed on a reader who, rather than killing the other, and rather than distrusting the other, should begin to read, begin to hear with generosity. In that way, truth goes beyond facts and merges into feeding us, becoming proper humans. So thus far, we have endeavored to understand why truth as a concept is decaying, and the historical intellectual streams that flow into that river of death. I've argued that there are such things as facts, and that facts are not open to perspectives, but are matters of truth. And in the last few moments, I have tried to explain that truth goes beyond sheer facts, forming an alliance with trust that goes to the very heart of what it is to be a human being. The decay of truth is an existential threat to our very humanity. That's my point. And so we sit here in this glorious chapel on the 11th of November, having no doubt at some point in the day remembered those who gave up their lives so that we might have freedom. What have we done with that freedom? There's a grisly, violent interchange between the Ukraine and Russia, destructive engagement between Israel and Palestine, a terrible civil war in the Sudan, where such is the loss of blood that pools of blood can be seen from space. At home and abroad, there's growing economic inequality leading to political tension and, frankly, shameful poverty. Throughout Europe, there is a growing hatred, and hatred is not too strong a word, directed towards the foreigner and the migrant. And all over the Western world, the political rules of the game are wobbling. As Hannah Arendt, the German and American philosopher most famous for being Heidegger's mistress, writing in 1951, cautions us. The ideal subject of totalitarian rule is not the convinced Nazi or the convinced communist, but people for whom the distinction between fact and fiction, the reality of experience, and the distinction between true and false, the standards of thought, no longer exists. Not only the political, but each and every one of the challenges I've mentioned is exacerbated by a loss of truth in institutions and in each other. A willful disregard for truth and mounting intolerance. These conditions, as applied to Europe in the years immediately following the Reformation, did not go well. And we are watching history repeat itself. And yet it's not too late to apply the brakes and regroup, but it will take a monumental effort of societal and political retrenching, and perhaps that needs to be an upward movement. If we are convinced that truth is part of reality, we ought to say so, and not accept the disinformation peddled in the media and at the dispatch box. The short story writer Isaac Bashevis Singer puts it this way. He says, at one time a lie was a lie. Today they've given the lie a fancy name, propaganda. We have a more fancy name, disinformation. But Singer is right. It is only a fancy name for a lie. If we are to thrive as human beings, if we are to trust each other, if we are to acknowledge and work for truth, lies are not acceptable. It becomes our duty to build up trust, to defend truth. I consider this duty as not beyond us, because as a theologian and a priest, I acknowledge that we are absolutely dependent beings. Dependent on the one in whom we place our trust for every breath we take. I'll leave the last word of hope to Dante. In fact, the very last words of his Divine Comedy, remembering that in the medieval period, a comedy was a work that began in misery and ended in joy. May it be so. His epic poem ends in the hopeful presence of l'amor che muove il sole e l'altre stelle. The truth, that is the love that moves the sun and all the other stars. Thank you.
Thank you, Hueston. I think I knew, like everyone in the chapel tonight, that this lecture would be stimulating, that it would be challenging, that it would be intellectually rigorous and intellectually first-rate, which makes life very difficult for your interviewer. To return to that sporting analogy, it's a bit like Accrington Stanley coming up against Arsenal. In previous years, Martin Stanford, a professional interviewer, would have been sitting in this seat. How I wish we had stuck to that template tonight, but it has been a terrific lecture. And I know we're slightly pressed for time, but there are a couple of questions I would like to ask you. I was interested in what you said, that it's not too late. This can be turned around. It requires a monumental effort, societal, political, but it requires an upward movement. What is that upward movement?
I think we need to, in a way, we need to take responsibility and not just look at the other and say, you know, this person happens to be in office. Note the use of language, in office, not in power. That's been a great problem with a misunderstanding of what it is to be a British politician. When I was a child, British politicians were in office. Now they're in power. Mm-hmm. But we ought to speak to those in office, to express our dissatisfaction when we think the truth has been meddled with in a significant manner.
But we live in such an age of noise and huge amounts of information and opinion. How does that voice get heard?
I think it gets heard by speaking with your people in office or with people who have significant voices.
Which we do, which we try to do.
Do we?
But does it make any impact?
Well, I mean, you can but try, right? You can but try.
Yeah, so the ship hasn't sailed. You think this is retrievable?
I think it is retrievable, but I think it is a mighty difficult ship to turn around. But if we don't retrieve it, and we do let history repeat itself, it will be destructive.
Right. And when you look at political life at the moment, and I'm very grateful that you didn't mention Donald Trump too much. I'm not sure our reserves are up to the libel suit that might follow. But do you see that truth in political life is really gone now? It's whatever a politician wants to believe is truth.
But why do we support that? Why do we shouldn't support it? I mean, if we think that any politician, and I'm not wanting to pick on Donald Trump in particular, because we've had such politicians in this country, we've had such politicians in Ireland, we've had politicians who have been, the phrase used to be economic with the truth. Now it's a sheer disregard of the truth. But what amazes me is knowing that this is the case, we go out and put an X at the ballot box beside the name.
Yeah, and how do you stop that?
I don't understand what you do with that.
So you are hopeful?
I am hopeful, yes. I mean, I was more hopeful before I started this interview. But I am hopeful. But this is not an insignificant matter. This is a moment of crisis in the global political, cultural development of our time.
And do you think that the political situation we're living through now has put what you started your lecture with, climate change,
Yeah.
has knocked that almost off the agenda.
No, I think climate change is very much on the agenda. I'm more positive about climate change. I think that the Climatics report that came out at the beginning of this month was very clear that there are things that we can do and we are close to doing that will make a huge difference. This is a big task also. I mean, another major task. But we know the road to take. It's now getting the politicians to agree to go down the road, and not just the politicians, but global industry and global business to go down the road.
And that is what the upward movement is, the individual.
I think the individuals ought to be campaigning for that to happen, yes.
Good. And on that note, it only remains for me to say thank you to Hueston for tonight's Elson lecture. And I would also like to say on behalf of everybody here, our board members, our council members, the Society of Leadership Fellows, the College of St. George, and indeed members of the congregation, a huge thank you to Hueston for what he has done for the college, for St. George's House, and to wish him and Anna well. There will be many other opportunities to say goodbye, but I couldn't let tonight pass without honouring the work that he has done over the past 16 plus years. We wish them well in King's College, Cambridge, and we're hugely grateful to them for all that they have brought to Windsor. And the truth of the matter now is that we should adjourn to the Dean's Cloister for the drinks reception, but do please join me one last time in thanking Canon Finlay for tonight's lecture.